Coming up, Dr. Magudumana's urgent application to have charges against her dropped following her arrest in Tanzania. She will be requesting that they be declared unlawful, and the matter will be heard in the High Court in Bloemfontein on Thursday. The Reserve Bank is expected to increase the repo rate again when it makes its announcement on Thursday. The MEC for Education in Gauteng, Magudumana, says the online applications for next year's Grade 1 and Grade 8 learners will be open on the 15th of June. Welcome. We are coming to you live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you for tuning in. You are watching The Week Ahead. You can interact with us on social media platforms at Week Ahead, #The Week Ahead. I'm your host, Asanda Magaqa. This Thursday, the High Court will hear an urgent application by Dr. Magudumana challenging her arrest in Tanzania. Thabo Bester's alleged accomplice and girlfriend, Dr. Magudumana, has filed urgent court papers in the Bloemfontein High Court seeking to declare her arrest and deportation as abduction in Tanzania as wrongful and unlawful. Bester and Magudumana were arrested in Tanzania after fleeing South Africa. Bester was jailed for rape and murder. Joining us now is Nthabiseng Dubazana of Dubazana Attorneys. A very good afternoon to you, Nthabiseng. Dr. Magudumana's legal team has not yet disclosed the grounds on which they'll be arguing for her release from prison, but on the surface, do you believe there's a chance of success?
Well, they first have to pass the most important test, which is that of urgency. So they have to show the court that indeed, one, their application is the one of an urgent matter. That's why they're requesting that the rules of the court be ignored in terms of service, etc., etc. And that hurdle is going to be quite difficult to jump in my opinion, because you have to prove that this urgency that you are saying is before you or is as a result of your right being trampled on is not urgency that was self-inflicted. So the reason for saying self-inflicted, we're looking at the time that has passed from the date she was detained and brought back from Tanzania to now, and the fact that she has relinquished her right to apply for bail in the eye of there is something new that has come up, and then she just in the meantime parked her right for bail application. So what kind of urgency is she going to show to the court that indeed her rights are being violated in one form or another? That's why the court should hear her matter in a manner of urgency. So if they are failing to show urgency on its own, the merits of the matter will not even be considered going forward. Because if urgency doesn't exist, then there's no need for the court to consider the entire matter.
The notice to court, Nthabiseng says she wants to declare the arraignment before the current magistrate in the criminal case nullified and set aside. Effectively, what does this mean?
Effectively, she's saying that her arrest was unlawful. And as a result, everything else that followed after the arrest will therefore be deemed unconstitutional and therefore unlawful, which means she shouldn't be before the court, which means she shouldn't have been charged. She shouldn't have everything that has happened to her since the day she was brought back into the country should not have happened, because her claim is that her arrest in Tanzania was an abduction and not an arrest. And if the court does find in her favor in that way, per her prayers in the notice of motion, then that effectively means she will be a woman that is set free. But that's going to be a very impossible task to accomplish, seeing as in criminal matters, these allegations that she's putting in a civil court on an urgent basis are always dealt with upon first appearance. So on her first appearance, this should have been the date where she said, listen, my arrest was unlawful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 happened. Instead, it was supposed to be in this other manner. And therefore, I want this evidence to be brought to court to show to the court that my arrest was indeed unlawful. And then on the next occasion, on the next appearance, this information is brought to light. And if the court is of the opinion that indeed her arrest was unlawful, then her charges by now would have been dropped because everything else that followed would have been unlawful. So what she's trying to do now to get the civil court to declare or pronounce on a criminal court situation kind of mirrors another case that we know that has been happening this past week. So it's not really the correct way to go.
And the court application highlights the need for a thorough examination of the legality of Magudumana's arrest and detention and raising questions about potential violations of her constitutional rights. Now, can these actions be characterized as abduction, as the notice says?
I wish I had the benefit of reading her founding affidavit so we can understand why she's basing the notice of motion on. So if we're looking at the rules of extradition, basically, that two countries have an agreement that if there's a wanted person in your land, please assist us in detaining that person so that they can be brought back to our country to answer to the crimes that they have done. So based on that alone, I don't know where she's basing that she was abducted instead of being arrested. Is she alleging that the manner in which South Africa and Tanzania colluded in lack of a better term, in getting her back to the country was done illegally? Is she saying that the South African police are the ones that detained her illegally within the borders of Tanzania? Is she saying that the Tanzanian police officials did not treat her constitutionally in terms of which law, South African law or Tanzanian law? That is where the issue is. I think if we had clarity on how she believes that this arrest of hers was unlawful and therefore deemed as an abduction, we'd have a clear way of seeing where she's going with these arguments. But for now, it is not very clear where she gets the idea that her arrest was an abduction and therefore unlawful.
And as we know, Magudumana faces multiple charges, including fraud, defeating the ends of justice, and assisting an inmate to escape from prison in connection with Thabo Beste's escape from Mangaung Correctional Center in May last year. Is suspicion of such activities generally enough to warrant an arrest?
Correct. Remember, the way that criminal law works, the complainant fills in an A1 statement, and then based on that A1 statement, the investigating officers will then go detain the accused. It's based on a suspicion because at that stage, there is no real proof. That's why the matter, you get arrested and then you get an opportunity to apply for bail while further investigations are being conducted. So it is sufficient for you to be a suspect and also be detained. This was confirmed in one of the very earlier cases of our earlier constitution before it was made the final constitution, the interim constitution, wherein suspected persons and arrested persons are put under the same banner. And therefore, it is right that she was arrested as a suspect whilst investigations are continuing. Should the investigations continue and then they show that she really is not a suspect, then of course charges will be withdrawn and she will be let go. But in the event that they do confirm that the suspicions that were already there, then she continues to be a detained person as a result.
I know, Antabi, saying we're wading into the space of speculation now, but back to what the court will be presented with on Thursday. Could any of her co-accused, including Biesta, support what she's claiming?
They would have to file confirmatory affidavits that are going to go hand in hand with the founding affidavit, and they can only file confirmatory affidavits based on whatever is said in the founding affidavit. So, for example, if she's going to say that in order for me to cross the border to Tanzania, Thabo Bester had to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he would just confirm with a confirmatory affidavit that says that on the parts in her founding affidavit that refers to me, I confirm the allegations therein. That's as far as it can go. That's the nature of an urgent application. It doesn't give us the opportunity to express everything that we would like to express.
And lastly, Ntabi saying there's been much made of Besta and Magudumana's virtual appearance in court in the past week. Is that peculiar?
No, it really isn't. It happens more often than not, especially in regional court matters. The purpose usually is that the courts tend to get crowded, one. Two, the correctional services cannot get the accused to the court on time. And usually, if it's just going to be a postponement and not like a bail application or a trial, then it's always easier to just make the postponement virtually and then life goes on. So that wasn't really peculiar.
Thank you very much, Ntabiseng. That is where we're going to leave it. Ntabiseng Dubazana of Dubazana Attorneys. And the week ahead continues after this break. The Reserve Bank is expected to increase the repo rate again when it makes its announcement on Thursday. Economists say the central bank will likely hike interest rates by anything between 25 and 50 basis points. This as it tries to bring down inflation, which has been above its target bracket for exactly a year this month.
Consumers continue to battle the high cost of living, and it does not look like things are about to get any better. Food and fuel inflation remain upside risks, and it's expected the load shedding will also add salt to the wound. This as businesses invest in alternative energy to keep operations going and passing some of those costs to consumers. The weak rand-dollar exchange rate is also not helping matters. The local currency has been above the 19 rand mark to the dollar, meaning imports are more expensive.
Developments the past couple of weeks, especially the last 2 weeks or so, resulted in significant volatility in the exchange rate of the currency as well as a much weaker capital market. The result of that is more inflation expectations and actually more inflation going forward. And I'm afraid the Reserve Bank is likely to increase interest rates again now in order to curb inflation and especially inflation expectations. And I expect the Reserve Bank now to increase interest rates by another 50 basis points, bringing the repo up to 8.25%. I'm afraid many people are probably going to blame the Reserve Bank for this, but if we want to blame somebody, we have to blame politicians for mismanaging the economy, but especially mismanaging recently the political situation in South Africa's relations with many of the major economies and other countries in the world.
The high interest rate environment will have a dampening effect on the already weak economy.
It will be difficult for growth prospects from businesses and small businesses because when the rates are high, it is expensive to have credit facilities. But like on the side of the consumers, it will as well be difficult for retail market to boom because consumers are deeply pressed. So from both contexts, these are, indications that the economy will not really thrive as expected. And when we look on the forecast that we had in the beginning of the year, whether it's 1%, whether it's 2%, depending on like economists, I believe we might grow below 1%.
The Reserve Bank expects the local economy to grow at 0.2% this year. Mainly to blame is the electricity crisis. Gloria Sefako Mosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
For more on this, we're now joined by Dr. Azar Jamin, who's the Director and Chief Economist at Econometrics. A very good afternoon to you, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us on the week ahead. The repo rate is reportedly increasing this week. However, some economists expect there to be no change. What's your take on the matter?
Unfortunately, I am inclined to believe that there will be an increase in the repo rate and probably a substantial increase of 0.5%, mainly on account of the fact that the rand has depreciated sharply in the last few weeks, and that will of necessity generate significant inflationary pressures. And there is evidence to suggest that the markets around the world are actually calling for an increase in interest rates in order to be attracted to buy into South African government bonds and deposits in rands. Otherwise, they will pull their money out of the country. And that is likely to put a lot of pressure on the Reserve Bank to increase the repo rate. The other thing to bear in mind is that interest rates around the world have continued increasing until recently, and that means that South Africa will be left behind again, and with risks to further falls in the rand if it doesn't actually increase its interest rates as well.
Now, some of the consumer fears, Doctor, include increasing food prices, load shedding costs, and a weakening rand, as you already spoke about. Is it all doom and gloom? Should we expect more to come as far as increases are concerned this year?
The hope is that this might just turn out to be the last interest rate increase. A lot will depend on what happens to the rand and what happens to food prices. Unfortunately, on both these grounds, there is a lot of uncertainty as to whether indeed we have reached the end. In regard to food prices, we know that theoretically we should have already had a decline in food inflation given the decline in food prices globally. But the reason why food inflation has been so elevated in South Africa is because of load shedding and the manner in which this has disrupted the production of food in many different areas and increased the costs of production as well, which has compelled food producers to pass on higher costs onto consumers. In addition, obviously prices are rising because of insufficient supply. And then as regards the rand, we have shot ourselves in the foot a lot by through our political shenanigans in terms of embracing Russia, which has resulted in many international investors actually shying away from South Africa and selling out of the country. Over and above that, of course, load shedding, if we have an intensification of load shedding, as we fear during the winter season to stage 8, as has been suggested is likely to happen, Eskom suggested that last week, then there'll be further damage to economic growth, and that in turn means lower potential growth in the revenues that government collects from taxes, because people will be spending less, and that in turn will mean that government will be forced to borrow more to fund its expenditure. And rising debt levels are inimical to the desire of international investors to want to lend the money to South Africa, buy the bonds that the South African government issues.
And then, Doctor, how will this increase further affect the South African household? The South African consumer is currently struggling with paying back loans, bond and car repayments. And you've already spoken about how even the revenue service will be struggling to collect revenue from South African taxpayers. So how is this going to add to the burden of the South African domestic household?
Unfortunately, it will add onto the burden of certain households. You've got to bear in mind that the majority of South Africans are too poor to borrow money, and so are not directly affected by a rise in interest rates. They're far more affected by the rise in food prices than the rise in interest rates. But for that category of South Africans who are heavily in debt, clearly this will add to their burden. But you've also got to bear in mind that for pensioners and those people, especially some of the aged who have a lot of cash that they're too scared to invest for fear of losing that on the financial markets, they will now be earning higher interest rates. So to some extent, you have a countervailing compensation for those people. There is a portion of the public who will actually benefit from higher interest rates directly by getting a higher income. But they are probably in the minority. I think the ratio that is often said is 3 to 1. For 3 persons who are indebted, you have 1 who is not indebted who benefits from higher interest rates.
And what would you say are some of the structural impediments to higher growth for the South African economy?
Oh, my goodness, we could go on all afternoon. The first and foremost is the corruption and state capture that we've had over the past decade that has diverted resources that should have gone towards development and service delivery, but went to the pockets of a handful of connected individuals and politicians. The second, linked to that, is the manner in which the state capture has eroded the ability of state-owned enterprises and other government agencies to spend on more vital areas. Investment has been lagging behind very badly. But over and above that, there are fundamental weaknesses. The big fundamental weakness that was borne out this past week is the lack of decent outcomes in the educational system. So many of the youngsters who leave school unable to really add value to the economy because they have had a poor education. Not all. There's a minority who get a very good education, and thank goodness for that, because they're the ones who keep the economy going. But the majority of youngsters really have very little future with the kind of poor quality education they receive. And this last week we saw that South Africa came last out of, I think, 60 countries in terms of ability to read at the grade 4 stage.
Dr. Azad Jameen, that is where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much for your time. Dr. Azad Jameen is a Director and Chief Economist at Econometrics. Now, the higher stages of rolling blackouts that South Africans have had to endure this year has seen a sharp increase in the demand for diesel. Eskom has been running its open-cycle gas turbines over time, and ordinary business and households are turning to fuel to power generators in order to mitigate the effects of the rolling blackouts. Even fuel service stations are having to ensure they have diesel, not just for sale, but to run their operations. This lived reality is adding untold costs to businesses and consumers. SABC News business reporter Nompumelelo Siziba filed this report.
Displaying their wares at an agricultural fair, Jerry Car manufacture fuel trailers and fuel transfer equipment, among other things. They note that since load shedding has gone out of control, they're having to work overtime to keep up with orders.
The biggest demand for our products is guys that have shops, factories, because they all need to have some kind of power generation. They have generators, diesel generators mostly, and that's our biggest market. Luckily for us, it benefited us, load shedding, in the sense that there's a big demand for these trailers, as you've mentioned.
Petro SA, which imports diesel into the South African market, notes that while demand for the fuel has shot up in light of incessant load shedding, the market remains well supplied, even seeing a downward trend in prices due to a boost in international supply from different regions. As a state-owned company, it's been focusing on assisting Eskom to be well supplied with diesel to bring down the higher stages of load shedding.
Whenever there is most probably then what we call an erratic demand that we see in the market, we actually do what we call float 1 or 2 ships at a particular time with good economy, so that we ensure that Eskom actually is not exposed to higher pricing. So as we're doing that, we're able then to stabilize, the spend from the Eskom perspective.
Petro SA says in line with the government's move to create a national oil company, it's already working right across the fuel supply chain with various partners to better ensure energy security in the country. And that in the long term, securing more crude oil refinery capacity in the country is a key goal. Be that as it may, load shedding has ratcheted up the cost of doing business, with even fuel service stations' profitability under pressure, as they ironically have to utilize diesel to run their operations.
It's actually a cost of doing business. And on average, or minimum, you'll find that the service station is spending about 1,500 per day, especially if there is stage 6 load shedding. And that also can equates to about, ranging from 45,000 rands to about 90,000 rands per month.
As a multiple of cost burdens rise, namely general inflation and higher interest rates, this could also adversely affect the retention of jobs. The Fuel Retailers Association is calling on the government to intervene to alleviate the pressure.
Really, we're calling here for TMRE to actually listen to us, on this cost for diesel and operating the generators, because this is over and above the under recovery that we've been having on credit cards. So if somebody actually buys a diesel on credit card, it's a double whammy, because you're actually losing on the credit card cost, and also you're actually losing on the product that you are utilizing to run the service station.
The Reserve Bank has warned that as people look to alternatives to power their homes and businesses, like diesel generators, this is likely to add at least 0.5 percentage point to inflation this year. And unfortunately, it looks as though the cost of credit is also set to rise further when the central bank announces its rate decision next week. Nompumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Welcome back. The MEC for Education in Gauteng, Magudumana, says the online applications for next year's Grade 1 and Grade 8 learners will be open on the 15th of June. He says the admission application system has been upgraded to be faster and efficient. Announcing the commencement and process of the 2024 online admissions in Johannesburg this morning, MEC Chiluane urged parents to submit correct documents and avoid applying from internet cafes. Our reporters spoke to the MEC earlier on.
What I can say to parents is that they must be rest assured that their children will be placed. We are working around the clock. We won't wait for January to really try to find space. We are working, we already know, and we are doing it multi-streamed to ensure that we increase the capacity of schools, to ensure that learners are placed across. But what we can say to parents as well is that there's been a significant improvement from the system itself, and the system is at best the best that we have currently. I have to assure them that in the past, the parents would sleep outside schools for days, for a week or two, whatever, so that they are able to get an opportunity to register their children at their preferred schools. This time, you can do it in our working centers, you can do it at a school, or you can do it from the comfort of your home or work. So we have applied technology to make it much easier for parents to ensure that they get their children placed into schools that they prefer. So the system has really assisted us a lot. We could have been dealing with the chaos. Imagine 350,000 parents, because these are 350,000 learners, parents across in schools scrambling for space. That would be very, very, very difficult. And also the transparency of the system, who got placed where. We are able to pull out those data. So the system is the best thing that we could have done as a system, because our system is very big. We've got the biggest system in the country. That will include even private schools, with more than 3.5 million learners across the province in schools every day. So with such a big system, you need some form of technological advancement to ensure that it runs seamlessly. But in terms of spaces and educational support for schools, we're prepared, ensuring that in areas that we will experience high pressure, we've already put measures in place so that we mitigate now, so that by that time we get to that point. For instance, as you said, some parents in certain areas that preferred certain schools, we have given capacity to certain schools to increase the classroom space, and already some schools are already ready with that spaces, so we know that we'll be able to place. But we want to work with parents that the constitutional obligation for us as a department is to place learners in schools. And we are going to do that, but work with us.
All right, I just need to come in the MEC. You're talking about the improvements. We've heard this previously. Every year we are promised that there are improvements, but each year we find the receivers of those improvements not being happy. Those are the parents and their children. Can we go back a little bit? What are the challenges? What has made it so difficult? And if you had to put it in proper context, what are these improvements that you're talking about?
From the system side is the capacity to handle all the applications, and also the transparency thereof, so that parents can also be able to, and the communication. Because in the anxiety, I spoke about anxiety, that the anxiety of a parent applying and waiting for the SMS for months can be difficult. So we're improving the communication so that parents are able to, from time to time, get update in terms of how far is the application. Secondly, we know with this system, we're able to plan. We know where we will have pressure. Currently, we know. So we're placing measures to mitigate the impact thereof. The role of the parents is to ensure that work with us. If we're giving your child offers or spaces, trust us that where we place your child, they will get the same quality with the school that they preferred.
Which are the pressure areas? If you can just remind us, you touched on it. Just remind us, which areas have you already identified where you know there's always problems and there's always capacity challenges?
I'll not do it in district, I'll just in areas. The Kempton Park, Edenvale area, it's a high pressure area, Florida, Rodiport, Centurion, Montana. So those are the areas where and that's largely because of the development that has been taking place in those areas. So the development has not necessarily been complemented by infrastructure of schools there. So those are some of the areas. But we know that we know where to expect these pressures, and then we want to work with parents that where we will be placing your learners in and around, we are going to place them in a reasonable area where they'll also be comfortable. And the schools, they must trust that the schools that will be putting them, they will get what they expected from those that they preferred. But the 5 schools, we will do our best that we don't exit that preferred 5 schools.
The other concern from parents, from other stakeholders within the education sector, that there is not enough schools being built in particular Gauteng, that we know is overpopulated, and that is perhaps at the center of many of the challenges that are faced by the education system in the province, whether it is the issue of finding space or the issue of having bloated classrooms that make learning very difficult. It challenges discipline as well. We've heard the teachers complaining how much pressure they are under. How are you responding to that? What immediate and perhaps long-term tangible plan is in place to address the issue of not having enough schools in this province?
We've embarked on a multi-pronged approach. We currently, with the support of Treasury, we were able to get funding to build 18 new schools. We're currently finalizing that process of appointing service providers to assist us, and they've got timelines with the project manager. So we are going to be building 18 new schools to eradicate asbestos, to eradicate mobiles, and new schools within that particular number. And we have schools that are almost at completion. We've got about 5 or 6 to add to that. We've got also, we're also collaborating with, there's 56 schools that are in the pipeline to be built within our infrastructure department, as well as 57 rather, so that I get the numbers right. Also, we are partnering with the private sector to work with us so that we can collaborate and so that they can also assist us in building schools.
Are these long-term plans, or can some of these plans give immediate results? Because if we talk about these schools that will be built, and they will only be built in the next 5 years or 10 years, it compromises those who need help immediately.
No. We're talking about things that are quick. I've got a particular target that in the beginning of the academic year, I need to be opening schools daily for about a period of a week or 2. We need to ensure that. So there are schools that are almost there. And you know that if you work with correct collaborative partnership, you can literally work around the clock, because I know in some areas you can work 24 hours because the pressure is real, it's now. So once we start hitting the ground, we want the first set of schools by the end of the year. So we'll be getting a lot of schools.
those who continue to harbor the perception, the perhaps accusation that some of their children are being denied access in some schools, some areas, based on a language barrier. I'm sure you're very familiar with those accusations. They are very tense. They become political. You as a political head in the province, you stand accused of not protecting the previously marginalized groups in the country. How do we navigate around these nuances? They're very complex, but what are the rules, the lawful criteria in terms of admission?
No, there's no school that should deny any learner based on language. That is clear, all right? So these schools that are identified, we need to get a significant number. So if you don't have enough numbers, for example, a school, let's say you get 12 or 13 applications for English, as an instance, it's difficult to really set up a classroom because it's the cost. Rather take those learners and put them in other schools. But with adequate numbers that we see now happening, we are able to provide the support. That's why I said there are schools that were like that. I give you an example of a school in Kempton Park, Diarrheal. It used to be an Afrikaans only. We brought in English, we gave them capacity. Now they've got their first cohort of matriculants. So we are transforming those schools. But we need to work with parents, we need to work with those schools they are aware. But there's no school. I can say it here clearly that parents can be assured there's no school that will be denying any learner based on language. Whether it's Afrikaans, whether it's English, whether it's Pedi, whether it's Zulu, no. A parent, that's why within the application we said, choose your preferred home language, and then we'll take it from there. It doesn't mean that if you've chosen this language, you will be engaged as a parent, on the availability of this school with this language or that school with that language.
Welcome back. The Gauteng Health MEC, Nomantu Nkomo Ralihoko, is visiting Jubilee District Hospital in Hammanskraal after 67 cases of diarrheal disease in the area. Since Monday, 67 people from Kanana, Sirman Majaneng and Greenfield in Hammanskraal have presented symptoms of diarrhea, stomach cramps and vomiting, which led to 7 people dying. The National Department of Health announced this new outbreak yesterday. The disease, or gastrointestinal infection, is a common and often highly infectious condition that affects the stomach and intestines. For more, Gauteng Health Department Head of Communication, Mutalatala Modiba, joins us. A very good afternoon to you, Mutalatala. Now, what were the findings of the MEC's visit?
As we're talking now, the MEC, together with the MMC for Health in the city of Tshwane, are actually still at the facility conducting that oversight visit, and they've been receiving briefings from officials. And we are expecting that in the next maybe 30 minutes or so, once they're done with the briefing, they will then be able to make pronouncements in terms of what the findings are and what feedback they've received. But what I can say to you is that as of last night, the number had actually gone up in terms of the people that were seen at the facility. If I just check here, I think we were sitting at 67 people that had presented at the facility, and also we had an additional death. I think it was about 7 people that had passed on due to the disease. So the latest update in terms of the outcome of the tests that were conducted, because stools were taken, including water samples, those is what we are waiting for. And hopefully when the MEC gives an update just in a few minutes later, after they've done with their oversight, they would have gotten those particular results for us to be able to know as to this diarrheal disease, what exactly is it? Is it cholera? Is it typhoid? What exactly is it? So that we will know in the next hour or so, once the current briefing actually is concluded. But what we have been doing is that we have our outreach or outbreak response teams, both from the provincial level and also the district level, including at the municipal level, that have then been dispatched since we learned of this outbreak. They've been dispatched to communities, affected communities that you mentioned earlier on, to engage with communities there in terms of getting obviously samples, but also to spread advocacy messages, because at the heart of this is also strengthening your public health education messages. The issues around the usage of safe water to drink, what people should do to treat their water to make sure that it's safe to drink, the issue of maintaining good hygiene in terms of washing your hands with soap and water before you handle any food, and even when you come from the bathroom, and how to just maintain those basic, including also ensuring that when you prepare your food, boil it, cook it well, and also peel what you eat or wash it thoroughly with clean water. Those are some of the tips that we are actually re-emphasizing, because from a health point of view, it's important that in terms of public health education, we keep on educating communities that they us being able to keep a basic hygiene and also cleaner environment is contributes towards us being able to fight diseases or infections like the ones that we're currently dealing with.
Very important messages there in terms of public health, but let's just go back to where the cases have been reported. We've cited Ganana, Sirman, Majaneng, Greenfield in Hammanskraal, and you've already spoken around the teams that have been deployed, the district response teams that have been deployed. Let's talk more about that geographical lay. Are those the worst hit areas, and have we seen any spread beyond those borders or boundaries?
The worst hit area is actually, so far, according to the information that we had last night, was the Kanana area. It looks like a large percentage of those that have presented at Jubilee Hospital would have come from the Kanana area. So that would be the most hard hit. But if you know the Hammanskraal area, you would know that the Kanana area and Surman, they're not far from each other. And then Majaneng is on the other side. And if Majaneng, we've seen cases there, there's a likelihood that you might maybe see cases in the other areas like Silosecha and maybe your Lepengville that are close by. So at the moment, I think the current briefing or update that the MEC and the MMC are currently receiving is the one that will tell us in terms of the teams that have been on the ground, what are they picking? Are there other areas that you also need to consider? Because these areas are quite close to each other. So the likelihood is that you might find that even in the other areas, there is that particular impact. And hence, the message that we are sharing is not a message for those specific areas, but it's a message that is applicable for the whole of Hammanskraal, but also a message that is applicable for the entire province and the country as a whole. Because essentially, the same outbreak you would have seen yesterday that our colleagues in Free State also mentioned that they've got a cholera outbreak in that particular area as well. And it is the same issues of hygiene, the same issues of safe water to drink, and the conditions that people are finding themselves in, that we just need to re-emphasize those safety messages in terms of just taking extra precaution. If you suspect that food might be contaminated, rather stay away from it, but ensure that even when you store your water, it's stored in proper containers, and where people maybe say, we can get, we're not sure, rather boil your water up until where you see those bubbles, at least for a minute, and then allow it to cool down before you can at least consume that. If you can't do that, at least take a teaspoon of household bleach and pour it in, put it into 25 liters of water. Allow that to sit overnight in terms of for that to actually mix with the water before you can actually consume any of that water. So those are some of the practical things that people are able to do in their own households without incurring further costs.
You've urged people not to drink water from unsafe sources. You've also spoken about some of the preventative measures that people can take in their own households to ensure that they do not drink contaminated water. Are you working with other departments to ensure the availability of safe drinking water, mindful that this would require a multi-layered approach from all three different spheres of government, including the local sphere of government?
Correctly so. Our competency as the Department of Health is to obviously look at the health aspect in terms of service delivery. But you're quite right that there's dependencies insofar as service delivery is concerned. And in this instance, we're working closely with the municipality. There's also national departments of environmental affairs as well that would obviously have an interest insofar as the issues of water is concerned. So we're not just working alone, because as health, we are responding to the public health issue, but there are other stakeholders, as you have correctly said, who are responsible for actually ensuring that that particular part is actually taken care of in terms of the aspects around the cleanness of the water and all of those things. And hence, the MMC from the city of Tshwane, who's responsible for health, is also there because there's a huge role that the city would play. As you know, that the provision of basic water is a competence that resides within the local authorities.
Now, this disease or gastrointestinal infection, diarrheal disease, what the layman would refer to as a tummy bug or a stomach bug, occurs as the Department of Health urges the public to take extra precautionary measures and maintain proper hand hygiene, as also the country is experiencing increasing number of cholera cases. Are you dealing with these outbreaks combined in your response outreach?
Of course, we are doing that, and I can speak for the Gauteng province because that's where I'm located, but I have sight of also what is happening nationally, given that we are constantly in communication with the national team. But the response around this is a comprehensive and holistic approach. And if you look at your diarrheal diseases, it's a family of diseases which tend to manifest in terms of the symptoms. The symptoms are more or less the same. Mm-hmm. If someone has got diarrhea or typhoid, they are likely to experience diarrhea, running stomach. Mm-hmm. They're likely to have stomach cramps. They're likely to experience a bit of fever and dehydration. So the symptoms are more or less the same, and even the remedial measures that we're putting in place are not far from each other, because at the heart of that, as I said, is the issues around basic hygiene and ensuring that people don't consume contaminated food, but also they don't drink water that is unsafe to drink, and they take those precautionary measures, including just a basic thing that whenever you handle any food, just always wash your hands with soap, and just to make sure that your hands are clean, because the reality is that on a daily basis we touch surfaces. Even now, as you and I are having this interview, my hands are touching a table, and I can't just move from here and go and consume an apple or whatever. I need to then make sure that my hands are first cleaned, because this surface, I don't know what was on the surface and so forth, and I could be actually taking in something that might cause me problems later on.
And even with the vigilance in public health, with the messaging that you've been giving out, Mudaladala, at what point of experiencing the stomach cramps, the nausea, the vomiting, should a person go and present themselves to a health facility in case it's this particular disease?
We are saying that the minute that you see any of the symptoms that we just mentioned, present yourself at your nearest health facility, because in this instance with diarrheal infection, you might find that for a day to 3 days you don't see any symptoms, but after that you start seeing symptoms. The minute you start seeing symptoms and start seeing that you are starting to behave in an unusual way, you are going to the bathroom a lot, you are having a running tummy, stools and so forth, present yourself to the nearest health facility. More so now that in the Hammanskraal area we've got this particular outbreak that we're dealing with. It's safer to just present yourself to your nearest clinic, your nearest hospital, so that at least they can be able to have a look at you and give you proper medical attention before it becomes too late.
Does the Department of Health have the capacity to receive anyone and everyone who presents themselves with these symptoms?
We do have that particular capacity, because remember that even in the Tshwane area, it's not just Jubilee is not working alone. There's a cluster of facilities that are around. You've got Dr. George Mokari, you've got Steve Biko, you've got the Tshwane District Hospital, including clinics, both those that are operated by the municipality and those that are operated by the province. So capacity in a case of a disaster or an outbreak. We pull together all the resources and we're able to meet out a particular response to ensure that we curtail the further spreading of the current infection. So there is capacity because the Department of Health is not working in isolation. We're working together with multiple other stakeholders, including development partners within the health space who also have got their own resources and they are able to come in and assist whenever they are called upon.
Thank you very much, Mutalatala Modiba, for that comprehensive explainer of what we're experiencing in Gauteng and specifically in Hammanskraal. We'll certainly be looking out for the findings that the MEC will be presenting later on today. That is the head of communications at Gauteng Health Department, Mutalatala Modiba, talking us through that outbreak of this gastrointestinal disease, which Gauteng is currently experiencing in the Hammanskraal district. Now, on the 60th anniversary celebration of the Organization of African Unity, now known as the African Union, the organization is urging the media to seize the opportunity in shaping the narrative about Africa by telling the continent's journey since 25 May 1963. It's promoting the motto, "Our Africa, Our Future." The African Union's Information and Communication Directorate is calling on journalists to raise awareness around the Pan-African ideals of the OAU's founding members. It says there's a need to educate the population on the history of Africa while shaping the narrative and journey of the continent towards achieving its socio-economic and political development for the Africa we want. Created in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Organization of African Unity has always celebrated the Africa Day on 25 May in recognition of the vision and milestone achieved towards an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. And that's where we leave it for this edition of The Week Ahead. Until next time, have a fantastic afternoon. Thank you for tuning in.